Rwanda's President Paul Kagame has emerged as an internationally renowned figure, particularly for building a prosperous and harmonious new country on the ruins of the old one. But his is an unconventional life that has seen him being a poor refugee in Uganda, a top military official in the Ugandan army, and now the President of Rwanda. Paul Kagame's family fled Rwanda's pre-independence ethnic persecution and violence in 1961, crossing into Uganda, where Kagame spent 30 years as a refugee. He then had a military career which got him involved in some of the most extraordinary events and even wars of the 20th century. Paul Kagame was a founding member of current Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni's rebel army, and he then headed its intelligence wing, helping Mr. Museveni take power in 1986. Afterwards, as the leader of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, Kagame swept into Rwanda to halt the Hutus' genocide against their fellow Tutsis in 1994. The man known as Paul Kagame was born into a Tutsi family in 1957 in what was called the Tambwe commune, located some 65 kilometers west of Kigali, Rwanda's capital. Kagame's father, Deogratius Rutagambwa, was a successful businessman and also had agricultural interests. Paul Kagame's mother, Asturia, was a cousin of Rwanda's Queen Rosalie Gisanda, the wife of King Mutara III. It is fair to say that the family led a pretty comfortable life by Rwandan standards of the day. Their connection to royalty afforded the family some protection from periodic violent political campaigns waged by Rwanda's Hutu majority against the majority Tutsi elite. In this case, the European colonial powers, Germany and then Belgium, had exploited ethnic divisions among Rwanda's population, favoring the country's Tutsis over the Hutu ethnic group. In 1959, as Rwanda prepared for independence from Belgium, a violent incident sparked a Hutu uprising in which hundreds of Tutsis were killed and thousands displaced and forced to flee to neighboring countries. This wave of violence marked the start of the so-called Hutu Peasant Revolution, or the Social Revolution in Rwanda, which lasted from 1959 to 1961. This period signified the end of Tutsi domination and the sharpening of ethnic tensions within the country. At the height of the violence, local peasants armed with machetes, clubs, spears, and a few rifles were moving around the hilltops from village to village, setting light to homes and evicting or killing their residents. As such, when the mood in the country turned really violent, Paul Kagame's family would have been targeted along with other leading Tutsis for arrest and harassment by the perpetrators. This is why the 2-year-old Paul Kagame and his family fled their home with only the belongings they could carry. Shortly afterwards, their house was emptied of the remaining valuables and razed to the ground by looters. Many years later, Paul Kagame would revisit his birthplace only to find an almost empty hill and just 1 or 2 older survivors of the massacres. From their home in Tambwe, the family fled for nearby Nyanza, where they spent 2 weeks before continuing northwards to Paul's mother's birthplace of Mutara near the Ugandan border. There was, however, little prospect of any return to security and normalcy for the foreseeable future, and so in 1961, the family decided to move across the border to Uganda, the country which was to become their home for the next 3 decades. They joined with other groups of Rwandans who were streaming across the border during those years and moved further into Uganda's Ankole province, where refugee camps had by then been set up for Rwandan exiles. After some time, the family moved again, going further north and finally arriving at another refugee camp in Toro district, where they settled in mid-1962. They stayed there for the rest of Paul's childhood years. Life as a refugee in Uganda for the Rwandans fleeing ethnic persecution in the early 1960s was very hard. The refugee camps for those who were able to reach them were poorly equipped and infrequently supplied.
I was a refugee for 25 years, so almost the first part, 15, 20 years, were difficult. There's no question about it. The conditions under which we lived, whether it was feeding, as in the family.
Eventually, the refugees were allocated some land by the local Ugandan authorities to cultivate, but many ended up working as cheap labor for the local farmers in order to make ends meet. Despite these early hardships, the Rwandan exiles in 1959 and the subsequent years gradually began to integrate into Ugandan society, learning English and speaking less and less French, the language of their former colonial masters. Soon, many came to see themselves as Ugandans in practical terms, and as the months of exiles turned to years, then decades, much of their direct association with the motherland began to diminish. At the same time, political conditions back home remained unfavorable for a safe return, leaving the exiles in Uganda condemned to a state of long-term limbo. Their children were not spared from ill treatment in this foreign land. The young Rwandans, including Paul Kagame, were often subject to harassment, often reminding them of their outsider status. While in the refugee camp, young Paul Kagame befriended Emmanuel Gisa, who would later adopt the nom de guerre Fred Ruggiema. Fred Ruggiema's family fled Rwanda in 1960 when he was just 3 years old. The two boys, Paul and Fred, became the very best of friends, and people who did not know them thought that they were brothers. Paul Kagame attended primary school in Toro district where he learned English in a class of refugees. This was before moving to a Ugandan state school in Tare from the age of 9, where he finally began to mix with the local population. He performed very well and was at the top of his class in the last year of primary school in Tare. Even at this early age, Kagame's academic achievements were already causing administrative problems for the local authorities of Uganda. According to regulations, the top 3 students in the class qualified for a grant to go on to secondary school. However, since he was not Ugandan, Paul did not qualify, leaving the authorities in the difficult position of having to award the grant to a student with inferior marks or deny him access to the school. Fortunately, Paul Kagame benefited from financial assistance via a family friend based in Belgium that enabled him to continue his schooling, first attending Tare Secondary School. This sense of alienation in Ugandan society was later summarized in an interview with Paul Kagame, and I quote, "Professional advancement was restricted for Rwandans in Uganda. There were limitations on our progress." Paul Kagame's academic performance was not atypical of this generation of young Tutsi refugees. This group that came to be known as the 59ers showed both an appetite and an aptitude for learning and qualifications. However, the death of Paul Kagame's father, Deogratius, in the early 1970s, as well as the departure of Fred Ruggiema to an unknown location, led to a decline in his academic performance. In addition to this, Paul Kagame also developed an increased tendency to fight those who belittled the Rwandan population in Uganda. He was eventually expelled from Tare School and completed his studies without distinction at Old Kampala Secondary School. Through all his childhood, Paul Kagame had never been able to return to Rwanda, but soon the young man felt a growing curiosity to know more about the land of his birth. He began asking his parents about what it was that they had done to become refugees and why their situation continued to be the way it was. The young man was now on a journey of self-discovery, and so in 1977, Kagame arranged through contacts from his school to go to Rwanda and explore the homeland. He yearned to see the places and to know more of what had effectively become a forbidden territory for the young exile. Once he was in his homeland, Paul Kagame traveled more thoroughly in the country, and in this way he made the acquaintance of the real Rwanda. Soon enough, he knew many things about Rwandan life which his fellow exiles in Uganda could only hear about from others or guess about from distant childhood recollections. Kagame visited Rwanda again in 1978, and this time he did not take the chance of crossing the border directly. He first went through the southwest of Uganda into Zaire, and from there he passed through the Rutura area to Goma before crossing into Rwanda by the road to Gisenyi. Rwanda was quiet during those years. Juvenal Habyarimana had taken leadership of the country in 1973, continuing the Hutu line of authority. However, if Rwandan authorities had realized that Paul Kagame was related to the former Tutsi royal family and was a Rwandan refugee living in Uganda, his journey into Rwanda could have become perilous. Paul Kagame later said of the trips that, and I quote, "If someone had found out about me, known who I was from a refugee camp in Uganda and the family I came from, it could have been very dangerous. You had to be very careful then." His trips to Rwanda in 1977 and 1978, although only a few months of time altogether, greatly influenced his thinking and expanded his knowledge of Rwanda's economic and political challenges. The idea of someday returning to Rwanda and becoming involved in the political process was now firmly buttressed in young Paul Kagame's mind. Paul Kagame's life changed significantly when he was introduced to another graduate of Tare School who was to become his mentor and political inspiration. This man was a Ugandan called Yoweri Museveni. Some 12 years Kagame Sr., a political activist and already a determined opponent of the way the authorities were running his country, Yoweri Museveni came from the Hima ethnic group which was closely related to the Tutsis. Museveni was aware of the general plight of the Rwandan refugees and he knew that they perceived themselves as perennial outcasts. He also knew that their youngsters such as Paul Kagame would have little to lose in joining a rebellion promising to topple first the Ugandan government of Idi Amin and then later that of Milton Obote. Among Museveni's early recruits was Fred Ruguyema, Paul Kagame's childhood friend who trained with Museveni in Tanzania and Mozambique. Fred Ruguyema would become a much celebrated and decorated fighter and would eventually become a major general and deputy commander of the Ugandan National Army. In 1978, Fred Ruguyema returned to western Uganda and reunited with his friend Paul Kagame. Ruguyema then returned to Tanzania and fought in the 1979 war, during which Museveni's rebel group Fronasa, allied with the Tanzanian army and other Ugandan exiles, defeated Idi Amin. Inspired by Fred Ruguyema, Paul Kagame and other Rwandan refugees pledged allegiance to Yoweri Museveni, who became a cabinet member in the transitional government of Uganda. Upon joining Museveni's group, Paul Kagame traveled to Tanzania, where the Tanzanian government, which sought to protect the new Ugandan regime, trained him as a spy. Well, as it so happened, Yoweri Museveni became disgruntled with the now President Milton Obote, and in early 1981, his newly formed National Resistance Army, the NRA, made its first military strike against the Ugandan government. Paul Kagame was among this tiny band of 27 NRA guerrillas along with Fred Ruguyema. Very soon, Uganda was now engulfed in a gruesome and bloody civil war. For a number of years during the Civil War, Paul Kagame served as an intelligence officer in the NRA, and his work entailed gathering information in rural areas, a pivotal role in a guerrilla war with a relatively small number of troops. Paul Kagame often received assignments to go off on missions either alone or with one or two other officers to assess potential targets or glean details of enemy strength and military operations. From being a specialist in intelligence matters for 6 years with the NRA, Paul Kagame rose to become head of military intelligence in Museveni's army following Milton Obote's overthrow in 1986. Paul Kagame and Fred Ruguyema's military and political experiences in the NRA and its political wing, the National Resistance Movement, cannot be underestimated. They and other Rwandan exiles who had fought for Yoweri Museveni began to ask that if the NRA could liberate Uganda, then why could the Rwandan exiles not do the same in Rwanda? This is why in 1987 they formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF, which was born out of the Rwandese Refugees Welfare Foundation and the Rwandese Alliance for National Unity. Fred Ruguyema became president of the RPF with Paul Kagame as one of its core leaders. The two men, Ruguyema and Kagame, had complementary traits. Paul was known for his seriousness, and it is reported that even adults would go quiet when he entered the room. On the contrary, Fred Ruguyema was charismatic and was liked by many. Fred was known as a consensus builder, while Kagame was meticulously ruthless. It is these qualities that catapulted Ruguyema to the leadership of the RPF. Meanwhile, despite Kagame and Ruguyema's rise to prominent positions within Uganda's government, Yoweri Museveni knew that prejudice against Rwandan refugees was again growing within Uganda. By late 1989, feeling some strong political pressure, Yoweri Museveni demoted both Kagame and Ruguyema from their posts. In 1990, President Museveni sent Paul Kagame for military training to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas in the United States. It is believed that the assignment was a way to get Kagame out of the country, since Museveni knew that Kagame and Ruguyema were quietly planning a military push into Rwanda that would be launched from inside Uganda. If Kagame was absent, Museveni hoped the plans for an invasion into northern Rwanda by the exiles would be halted. At the same time, by 1990, Rwandan exiles in Uganda felt increasingly unwelcome in that country. With this in mind, the Rwandan exiles continued to organize and arm the RPF. The RPF started campaigning for the repatriation to Rwanda of the refugees and vehemently opposed juvenile Habyarimana's Hutu-dominated one-party state, which was now simultaneously losing support due to corruption, increased repression, and general economic decline. This decline in the economy in Rwanda was mainly because of the sharp drop in international coffee prices, the landlocked country's main export. In August of 1990, after 2 members of Kigali's elite fled to Kampala, bearing tales of how juvenile Habyarimana's regime was on the verge of collapse, Fred Ruguyema became convinced that the time was right to try and topple it. The RPF saw their chance and made their first attack from Uganda in late 1990, initiating what was to be a 4-year civil war. Unfortunately, this invasion in October was a disaster. Nothing went according to plan. Fred Ruguyema was killed on the second day of this attack, leaving fellow officers shell-shocked and demoralized. Moreover, the invasion drew France and other countries into the equation, and they began fighting on the side of the Rwandan government. On the heels of the RPF's invasion into Rwanda, France, Belgium and Zaire sent troops to aid the Habyarimana regime. By 4 October, France had sent 150 troops. Brussels followed suit with over 400 paratroopers. Mobutu Sese Seko, president of Zaire, sensing an opportunity to gain favor with France and Belgium, also sent several hundred of his top presidential guards to the aid of his longtime friend Juvenal Habyarimana. A few days later, after being deceived by a staged attack on the capital Kigali by the armed forces of Habyarimana and his now interim government, France committed an additional 600 troops. Paris continued its support throughout the war, and in addition to logistical assistance, underwrote and facilitated the purchase of over $10 million worth of military supplies.
We buy them from the contribution given by the Rwandese community internally here and in diaspora. There have been a very large Rwandese community outside Rwanda. We also capture a lot of equipment from the government forces.
I see a lot of South African weaponry.
Yes, you can be sure that one was captured from the Rwandese government because they have been buying lots of arms from South Africa.
As for the RPF, following Fred Ruguyema's death, Paul Kagame quickly returned from the United States and took over as leader of this organization. The RPF and its military wing, the Rwandan Patriotic Army, regrouped under his leadership, and by the end of 1991, Paul Kagame had managed to turn the RPF into a disciplined guerrilla force of about 5,000 men. Kagame's campaign yielded some success, and his forces managed to take control of an increasing swathe of territory against the odds of substantial military backing for Habyarimana's corrupt regime by the French, who sent paratroopers, military advisors, and financial support for a mass inflow of arms. But though capable of staging hit-and-run raids in areas of northern Rwanda, the RPF had gained little popular support. Because of this, Paul Kagame was amenable to approaches from members of what was now Rwanda's coalition government for talks. Intermittent peace talks between the parties involved yielded little success until an agreement between the RPF and the government, signed in August of 1993 at Arusha, Tanzania, called for the creation of a broad-based transition government that would include the RPF. Although outside Rwanda, these concessions generated goodwill and, more importantly, economic aid, inside the country they were greeted with great scorn. Hutu extremists were strongly opposed to that plan. Consequently, the dissemination of their anti-Tutsi agenda, which had already been widely propagated via newspapers and radio stations for a few years, intensified and would later serve to fuel ethnic violence in Rwanda. On the evening of April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Juvenal Habyarimana and Burundian President Cyprien Ntaryamira was shot down over Kigali. The ensuing plane crash killed everyone on board. Although the identity of the person or group who fired upon the plane has never been conclusively determined, Hutu extremists were originally thought to be responsible. Later, there were allegations that RPF leaders were responsible for the attack. Immediately that night, the organized killing of Tutsi and moderate Hutu, led by Hutu extremists, began. Rwanda's Prime Minister, Madame Agathe, a moderate Hutu, was assassinated the next day, as were 10 Belgian soldiers who were part of a United Nations peacekeeping force already in the country. These soldiers were guarding the Prime Minister. The murder of the Prime Minister was part of a campaign to eliminate moderate Hutu or Tutsi politicians with the goal of creating a political vacuum and thus allowing for the formation of an interim government of Hutu extremists. Immediately, the Speaker of the National Development Council, which was Rwanda's legislative body at the time, Theodore Sindikubabo, became interim president on April 8, and the interim government was inaugurated on April 9, 1994. Kagame's RPF rejected the legitimacy of this Hutu extremist interim government and they resumed fighting. By April 12, 1994, RPF troops had invaded the outskirts of Kigali. The next few months saw a wave of anarchy and mass killings in which the army and Hutu militia groups known as the Interahamwe and the Impuzamugambi played a central role. On July 4, 1994, after intense fighting, hill by hill and street by street, the RPF seized Kigali. In response, the genocidal interim government fled northward, then westward into neighboring Zaire. Terrified, traumatized and fearing retribution, 1 million Rwandans, nearly all of them Hutus, fled in the course of a few days. The corpse-strewn country that they left behind was not to capture the world's attention until later, as the full extent of what had occurred was only gradually acknowledged. Many RPF soldiers also carried out retribution killings. However, their leader Paul Kagame said that he did not support these killings. The Hutu who had fled Rwanda set up refugee camps in then Zaire, Burundi and Tanzania. Once the genocide was over, the country of Rwanda faced years of reconciliation and recovery. Trying those who were thought responsible for genocidal acts was a primary focus, as was promoting national unity and rebuilding the country's economy. A transitional government of national unity was established on 19 July 1994 with Pasteur Bizimungu, a Hutu, as president and Paul Kagame as vice president. Although Bizimungu was placed in the position of president, Paul Kagame held the real power in Rwanda. In 1994 to 1995, Tutsis first trickled, then poured back into Rwanda. For some of them, it was the first time they had stepped back on Rwandan soil for several years.
We had a lot of faith in the new government. After the RPF intervened and stopped the genocide, we knew that there was no turning point. So we believed, and we still do believe, that the atmosphere here for both political, economic and social development is, the possibilities are enormous. And
Pasteur Bizimungu resigned from his post as leader of the country in 2000, most likely having been forced to do so following a falling out with the RPF. He was replaced by Paul Kagame, who has been at the helm ever since. One day we will do a video on Paul Kagame's regime in Rwanda. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.